My name's Robert Lee. I'm Professor of History and Director of the Academic Program for the Bachelor of Arts and the Bachelor of International Studies at the University of Western Sydney. Good morning. I'm here to address the Henry White paper of 2011-12, and the topic of my talk is why history matters to Australia's Asian future. I've written it to be fairly controversial and very much addressing the issues of the time. So this is a synopsis of the paper. First of all, I'm going to talk about the Henry Report, called Australia's Asian Future, and its implications for secondary education. Secondly, I'm going to talk a bit about student international mobility in the tertiary sector, the university world today's kids that you teach are coming into, because it's very different from when we went to university. It's utterly different from when I went to university in the 70s, and different from when most of our teachers went to university, which is for most teachers nowadays in the 80s and 90s. Second, I'm going to talk about issues with the history curriculum, which is now a national curriculum, in years 7 to 10, and explore a few of the interesting issues that comes out of the Henry Report for it. And fourth, I'm going to look at issues with the modern history curriculum 11 to 12 in New South Wales, and explore some of the implications of the Henry Report for that. So that's the game plan for the day. Now, as I say, a good game is a fast game, so let's get straight on with it. The Henry Report was commissioned by then Prime Minister Julia Gillard to look at Australia's Asian future. And I'm going to quote from what the then Prime Minister wrote in her preface to the report. She said that history teaches us that as economic weight shifts, so does strategic weight. I think that's almost a truism. It's certainly been the experience of the last 500 years. The last 500 years has been all about Europe's growing domination of the world. So the big story of the last 500 years has been how Europe expanded and European culture came to take over other cultures. Some cultures were destroyed, all cultures were transformed by that experience. And that process, as I say, began towards the end of the 15th century with those two voyages of Vasco da Gama and Christopher Columbus. Vasco da Gama from Portugal to India in 1497, Christopher Columbus from Spain to the Caribbean in 1492. And from then on, European culture, European ways of doing things went right round the world with astounding speed. And by the 19th century, they were dominant. How long is that dominance going to last? Well, it's not going to last forever. As recently as the 1830s, probably, China was a larger economy than all of Europe put together. And it is heading that way again. She then went on and said that, or wrote that, thriving in the Asian century requires our nation to have a clear plan to seize the economic opportunities that will flow and manage the strategic challenges that arise. There are also great social and cultural benefits to be had from broadening and deepening our people-to-people links across the region. And the White Paper is a plan to build on our strengths and shape our future. So it details how by 2025, Australia can be a winner in this Asian century by becoming more prosperous, more resilient, and sharing in the new opportunities. And it calls on us all to play our part in becoming more Asia-literate and an Asia-capable nation. So that's the clarion call of the former Prime Minister. These are precisely the sentiments of the Prime Minister who preceded her and succeeded her, and indeed of our new Prime Minister, Tony Abbott. So having begun with some words from the then Prime Minister, let's move on. Specific Henry recommendations, and I'm not looking at the whole report, I'm looking at those especially about culture and education. As long ago as the Ghana report of 1989, which is now 15 years ago, There was a recognition of the importance of Australia and Asia being, quote, in each other's minds. And the scale and pace of change taking place in Asia makes it even more important today, unbelievably important. If any of you have been to China recently, it is astonishing what has happened. You know, to be able to travel on a high-speed train from Shanghai to Beijing running every 20 minutes and cover the 1,500 kilometres in 4 hours, it is just astonishing. Now, specifically, Henry addressed soft diplomacy and the projection of Australian power through education, sport, Indigenous identity, culture, travel and media. I'll just talk a little bit about soft diplomacy. Soft diplomacy is projecting yourself in a way that doesn't involve military power or necessarily even economic strength, but is largely cultural and social. And Australia is well placed to do this. There was a time when Australia's GDP was greater than all the countries between India and China combined. That's no longer true. We're no longer the top kids on the block economically. We're still militarily very important, but obviously India and China, not to mention Japan, have greater military capacity than we do. But when it comes to soft power, we're exceptionally well placed. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the reasons for that because they come largely from our history as well as present policy. So student mobility and internationalisation. It's a huge challenge for Australia. Now in Narromine, you probably won't like me saying this, but NAPLAN tests are actually important because they're part of international soft diplomacy. Proving that our kids are better than Singapore kids is what it's all about. Good NAPLAN results are the equivalent of a battleship in the 1930s. Right? They're about soft diplomacy. That's why the government put so much on it. This is saying Australia is strong. We have a strong education system. So in your schools, you probably have a lot of controversy about NAPLAN tests, and you probably find them in many ways totally painful. They're not just there for to make your life difficult or to make the lives of kids who have issues with school difficult. They are about projecting Australia's educational strengths abroad. Education is one of Australia's great strengths. We have an English language education system, very high levels of literacy in English. The only country in our region that rivals us is Singapore in that regard. But we can't be complacent. We have to keep standards high and rising. Another indicator of pardon me, our soft diplomacy strength is strong international student mobility figures. Once again, these are worth to a country what an aircraft carrier task force was in the 1940s. Soft diplomacy again. Education as a means of diplomacy and power projection. Now, I'm emphasising education, but other things also play crucial roles in this soft diplomacy power projection. And I'm talking about sport, culture and media. Just a little bit on those. Sport, World Cup, really important. Staying in the Football World Cup is really important. Selling rugby and rugby league in Asia is really important. I once met a very hungover Japanese kid on a flight from Sydney to Tokyo, and he was going back wearing his South Sydney jersey, determined to bring rugby league to Japan. That's soft diplomacy. The hangover wasn't malodorous, but at least this boy was a real diplomat for Australian culture. Now, Rupert Murdoch tried to do that with Super League. He didn't do a great job because Rupert likes to run everything, and that doesn't always work. But it was an interesting example of sport as soft diplomacy. The Olympics, of course, were very important to Australian soft diplomacy. Culture. Australia is the leading cultural centre of the southwestern Pacific. We have the major venues. We bring the big artists, both in popular culture and classical culture. So we're an important venue. Now, of course, in a globalised world where everyone can fly everywhere fairly cheaply, if you're in Xi'an or Calcutta, you can fly to Vienna as easily as you can fly to Sydney or Melbourne. But still, often for cultural reasons, people choose to fly to Sydney or Melbourne. We've got to make sure that that keeps happening. So cultural leadership is also important, and education clearly has a role to play in that. Media is important. Australia has the best public international broadcasting service in Asia, far and away, much better than Voice of America or the BBC. The BBC is pathetic nowadays. Australia has the best international public broadcasting in the region. Lots of people watch it. Listening rates to Radio Australia are enormously high. So these also play very critical roles. Now, why can Australia excel in soft diplomacy of this sort? Well, it can excel thanks to its British institutions. This is a very conservative view, isn't it? I'm sounding like John Howard here. So British institutions stand us in good stead. Second, no, I'm not sounding like John Howard, I'm sounding like Kevin Rudd. A high level of Asian migration. That helps us with our soft diplomacy. And three, high levels of student mobility. So they're all important factors with our soft diplomacy. So what's happening? Australian schools and universities are far more internationalised than ever before, and this will increase. At some state schools, up to 20% of their students are international. I suspect that's not the case in Narromine, but there are certainly schools on Sydney's North Shore. I know Turramurra High has 20% of its kids international students. Think of the money that's bringing into the state system. And also the experience of those kids. Some of them, of course, are using their education here to migrate. But others are using their education here to go back to their home countries. And those who migrate here will be bicultural, bilingual, at least, and of course will be bridges between their home countries and here. Universities have similar figures in some cases. This university where I'm sitting now, Macquarie, I think you can give me the figures, up around 26% of international students, isn't it? My own university, University of Western Sydney, not as many, around about 11%. So that's the kind of range we've got in Sydney. UNSW quite close to Macquarie. So between about 10% and a quarter of students are international students in universities. Australian students are travelling abroad far more for a semester or a short course for academic credit. How many? Well, in 2012, 20,656. Now, that's a lot of students. That is a lot of students. A big metropolitan university typically has about 35,000 students. That's about the enrolment of UNSW and UWS. Macquarie, a bit less, I think.
About 30,000.
30,000. So, you know, it's pushing a big metropolitan university. It's enough to fill the whacker, which gives, I think, a good perspective on how many people it is. It's expected to rise to 100,000 by 2017. That's enough to fill the MCG, and that's an awful lot of people. Why is it rising that quickly? Because of Commonwealth support. And this is really thanks to the Henry Report and thanks to Kevin Rudd in particular, really, who's a great supporter of this, because Kevin Rudd, as an undergraduate at the ANU, was able to go on an in-country experience in Beijing. We now have OS Help, which means that undergraduates can get a $7,000, actually it's $6,500 for most of the world and $7,500 for Asia, loan, interest-free, as part of their HECS bill. So they only repay it when their income gets up above about, what is it, 45,000 or so nowadays. So there are interest-free loans on your HECS bill. If you never earn that much, you never repay it. What this has done is democratised the experience of going abroad. It means that any Australian kid no matter how poor their parents, no matter what their background, can have an international experience and afford it. And there's additional funding to universities for specific programs. Now, we've never had anything like that before in this country, and that's why the numbers are going up so quickly. The opportunities are truly fabulous, and the outcomes are also excellent in terms of career results. Well, where did they go? This is interesting. About 38% went to Europe, about a third of them, 33%, went to Asia, and a bit under a quarter of them went to the Americas, and the rest of the world isn't very much when you tot those up. It's under 10%. So that's where the kids are going, and we expect 100,000 of them a year to be going abroad by 2017. That's 3 metropolitan universities. So if we go to a town that's got 3 metropolitan universities, Brisbane, if we look at Brisbane, a capital city, 3 metropolitan universities, one of those universities is overseas at any one time. So, you know, QUT is overseas at any one time. Or Griffith University is overseas at any one time. So that's the future of the kids you're teaching. And all this can only increase, and to my mind, our history teaching should reflect the realities of internationalisation and this increasing integration with Asia. A third go to Asia. It's a myth they don't go to Asia. A third of them go to Asia. So now the 7 to 10 history curriculum and Henry. Now, you're from Narromine, guys, so this is really important to you. Recognition of the Indigenous element in Australian history is admirable. And Henry recognised that Indigenous culture was a big selling point in Australia's soft diplomacy. And that's, you know, front and centre in the 7 to 10 curriculum. So is recognition of the importance of immigration, which is, of course, a central reality of the Australian experience since 1788. I always tell my students that Australian history is in 2 halves, a long half, which goes up to 1788, and a short half, which is since 1788, and in that short half, the central reality is immigration. Gillard said Australia should play its strengths in Asia, and in playing its strengths, that means we need to have, in my view, a less black armband view of Australia's past. So here I'm a surprising conservative. Right? In the history wars, I'm going to say, I'm not quite a historian. I think Keith Windschuttle's work was nonsense and offensive, but I do agree with John Howard that a black armband view is not desirable. Right? That we should recognise the strengths of Australia's past as well as the weaknesses. What does this mean? What strengths do we have? Well, I think we do need more recognition of the strength of British institutions and human rights. The rights of British subjects in Australia, no matter what their race. The importance of the rule of law and private property. This is why there's so much investment coming into Australia. Australia is a great place to do business. Right? Even Tony Abbott in the election campaign wasn't willing to talk down the countries as a great place to do business. It is true our taxes are higher than in Singapore and Hong Kong, but we do have a fabulous legal framework and respect for private property. And the only other places in Asia that have comparable legal frameworks are Singapore and Hong Kong. Also the importance of human rights in Australian history, and also the carefully crafted non-racial element in the history of Australia's legal framework of social development. This might be a little left field to some of you because it challenges a lot of notions about the White Australia policy and policy towards Aborigines. In fact, most legislation in Australia never mentioned race. There was a bit of colonial legislation which discriminated against Chinese. Of course, the so-called White Australia policy did not mention race. The Immigration Restriction Act of 1901 had no reference to race. The only Commonwealth legislation that referred to race was legislation about Aborigines under the guise of protection. And that's true of states too, under the guise of protection. So, some practical conservative ideas, since we've just had a conservative election victory. British law and a civil policy are Australia's biggest selling points in Asia, just ahead of cute marsupials, lots of minerals and beaches. So British laws and civil polity and policy are very important. So I think in our teaching we should emphasise the benefits of British institutions and law. And we can see this in unedifying examples. The Mile Creek Massacre and Trial is a classic example, the way Governor Gibbs responded to that. To my mind, it doesn't show what a bunch of racist louts colonial Australians were. It shows that there were racist louts in colonial Australia. But it also shows how effectively British law worked in a colonial setting to curb and punish violence against Indigenous peoples. I mean, they did, after all, end up swinging from the scaffold in Darlinghurst Jail, the guys who did that. I'd like to emphasise free trade as an essential element in Australian history. The idea of Australia as a trading country and even in a trading empire. I've just been reading a new biography of Alexander Macquarie, and some of the quotes are astonishing. People even in the 1820s are writing about the great empire in Australia. Even in the 1820s, when the population of Australia was under 100,000. Governor Phillip's first report back to the Colonial Office in May of 1788 was an extraordinary one. He first of all wrote about the difficulties of establishing the colony. He said there wasn't much food yet because we hadn't been able to plant the grain, and we've only just found where there's good soil. And he said it was all pretty difficult, but we're getting on with it. We're making good bricks and we've got the buildings up and everything. We're going to be fine. And his conclusion was an astonishing one. This will be the most valuable acquisition the British Empire has ever made. That's a big call, a very big call. It's turned out to be pretty much true. Australia has become the pivot of British power in the Southwest Pacific, and of course it has been a massively valuable acquisition. We now have half the population and more than half the GDP of the United Kingdom. I think most of your students will live us to see having pretty much the same population and the same GDP as the United Kingdom. So, also something else about Phillip, how prescient he was. In 1790 he proclaimed Neutral Bay as Australia's first special economic zone. Neutral Bay in Sydney was a place where ships of any country could trade. They could come and get supplies, they could be assured of refuge, even if they were the ships of an enemy of the United Kingdom. Extraordinary. Free trade, anyone can come there, and anyone would be assured of protection. More than that, he even said there'd be no taxes, no customs duties. Let's look at the Chinese in the colonial period. Often they're seen as victims. You know, we talk about the Lambing Flat riots. Terrible events, 1861. But the Chinese weren't just victims. They made cultural choices and they took control of their lives. A lot of the Chinese came here intending to get money and go back. And they were males, you know, that famous statistic, 60,000 Chinese males in Victoria in the 1861 census, 8 Chinese females. Now clearly that's not a basis of an enduring society. So they made their cultural choices and took controls of their lives. Most of them always intended to go back, but many chose to become British subjects living in Australia. And those who did often emphasised their status as loyal citizens. At the time of Federation, welcoming the Duke of York, there were triumphal arches in Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane, erected by the loyal Chinese citizens. So pride in identity and their status as loyal British subjects of Australian residents, in some cases Australian birth. And the Immigration Restriction Act I think you all know it imposed a dictation test. It didn't, or it allowed an immigration officer to impose a dictation test. It was deliberately non-racist. And from 1904, this is often totally ignored, the Japanese were exempt. An agreement was negotiated by the Japanese Consul General in Sydney with Alfred Deakin, and the terms of it were that no Japanese with a passport would be given the dictation test at an Australian port. Japanese could enter freely if they wished. So it wasn't quite as racist as is often presented. Another conservative thing I'm going to say, I think Lachlan Macquarie deserves his profile restored. Now this university is named after him where I'm sitting. My own university, the University of Western Sydney, is on a site established by Lachlan Macquarie. Its pride and joy is a female orphan school, which Lachlan Macquarie set up as a social initiative beside the river, Parramatta River at Rydalmere, now the home of the Whitlam Institute. And you're on the Macquarie River, exactly. He was the first governor to seek to ensure Indigenous people have rights as British subjects. And he experimented with the practical problems of coping with cultural difference. He tried all sorts of different things with Aboriginal people. He tried schools for them, he tried integrating them into schools, he tried settling them on farms in different places. He encouraged kind of meeting places, black-white corroboree sort of things where they could meet. He tried all sorts of things with greater or lesser degrees of success. And he was the first governor really to try this sort of thing. So, and in that way he anticipates many future governments. I have a thesis, which is that basically every Australian government of any worth has essentially followed the policies of Lachlan Macquarie ever since. So he really is the father of Australia in that sense. He established the basic Australian principle of social equality. Everyone, no matter what their background, there's a typo there, was equal before law and entitled to a fair go. And this included convicts and it included Aborigines. He encouraged sport as a means of social integration of the different classes and to promote human happiness. He was the first governor to do that. The first race meeting and the first athletics meeting were both held in Hyde Park in 1815. He encouraged the importation of good blood stocked by the wealthy and the regulation of gaming to protect the poor. And there was a big ball after both of these events at Government House. And of course every government in Australia has done much the same thing ever since. He also believed in a strong state with a strong budget and an active public works program to promote employment. And this existed beside an enterprise society which rewarded hard work. Even convicts could negotiate after hours and even sometimes in their government hours work rates and pay. So they would actually negotiate. We have to lay so many bricks for the government, we'll do that, and after that you pay us. So we've got negotiation of work rates, even by convicts, in this early period. And this combination of a strong state, but also an enterprise society, is why Australia is so different from the US. We look to the state for a stronger lead and more functions, but we're still an enterprise society. These are characteristics which are pretty much unique to Australia. So curriculum, history curriculum and Henry, years 11 to 12. Now this is where I'm going to be most controversial. As I said, this is for teachers more than students. Clearly there needs to be a move away from European history. I can't say often enough that a senior history curriculum, whose main emphasis is Germany, is wildly inappropriate for 21st century Australia. That doesn't mean Europe isn't important. As I said right at the beginning, the spread of Europe has been the big event of the last 500 years. The world that we live in now, while we're looking at an Asian century, it's an Asia that's been transformed by Europe and America, by European things and European ideas. So what I've said here is European ideas, technology and governance have changed Asia almost as much as they've changed Australia since around 1790. And incidentally, I say 1790, it's an important year. The Bengal settlement, which establishes British rule in India, the annexation of Penang, the first British possession in the Southeast Asia, now in Malaysia, the first fleet coming to Australia, and the setting up of the Canton trade system, which opens one port in China to trade, were almost simultaneous responses to, by the British to the loss of much of British North America. They signed the treaty with the new United States of America in 1783, and then there's almost immediately this swing to the east. And Australia's part of that. So we're all part of that. So Europe has changed Asia, it's changed Australia. So I think rather than looking at the minutiae of German politics, we should be looking at things like European imperialism and Asian responses, just as we look at European imperialism and Aboriginal responses in Australia. Because they're interesting, they're intelligent responses, especially ideas like free trade, Marxism, capitalism, all these sorts of things, liberalism. Tony Abbott's our new Prime Minister, so we should, well, not yet, I think he's about to be. So liberalism, so European ideas and technology, railways, steamships, public medicine, aviation, post and telegraphs. Everyone loves them. We often talk about China, sometimes Indonesia. I think Japan and Thailand are particularly interesting case studies. Our kids never study Thailand, but it's a very interesting country, quite close to us. And Japan, of course, much bigger country, with much the same sort of experience as Thailand. And Australia, of course, has led Asia in many of these developments because our Indigenous society was weaker than the countries of Asia, where there were very powerful states in place. So Australia has led Asia in a lot of these developments. You know, the first railways in Asia were right here in this country. Good example. So that's the year 11 to 12, history curriculum and some thoughts from the Henry Report. A few resources. I've included there the that's Rob Malicki's slideshow about all that's available as opportunities for kids when they go abroad. There's an enormous amount of opportunities for them to go abroad. And you can tell your kids in Narromine, you know, their parents mightn't have many resources, but they thanks to our education system, they can go to university and they can go and spend a semester in Japan or the United States or wherever they want to go. And unless they get a well-paid job, they'll never have to pay for it. How good is that? And if you want to read the Henry Report itself, there it is. I don't think a British perspective is a bad thing. You know, I've actually said, I've agreed with John Howard, you know, we should say more about our British heritage because it's one of our great strengths. You know. All those British institutions we've inherited are an enormous strength. And of course what's interesting about Australia, and indeed all the neo-Europes, as Alfred Crosby calls them, you know, the United States, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, Argentina, Brazil, all these countries, they're all similar in a way, but they're all different. And what makes them different? Well, it's the indigenous cultures they have, it's the immigration patterns they have from the original colonising power. And in some cases there are two colonising powers. Canada's a good example of that. The US to a lesser extent. South Africa, certainly two colonising powers. And then the other thing is the later waves of immigration. So they're what make our countries unique. You know, that's why Australia is different from New Zealand. And it is quite different. And the main difference between Australia and New Zealand is actually Indigenous culture. That's the main difference between our two societies. The patterns of migration from the United Kingdom in the early days were rather different because we had all these Irish convicts and they didn't. But the recent migration from Asia is much the same in New Zealand as it is in this country. Yeah, but not as good as ours. They do, but they don't have as much money as we do. Also, our government, because of the Henry Report, has been funding this really generously. At my university, as well as the students having OS Help, which will give them $7,500 as an interest-free loan, only repaid when they earn a certain amount. I've also got, how much is it? Quite a lot, $100,000 to send 20 students, it's a lot of money, to Hong Kong. So next semester, those kids will get the $7,500 if they want it, and they'll get $5,000 from the university. Now, $5,000 from the university might do it. And they're also eligible, if they're on any Centrelink payments, to keep those while they're abroad. And it is, to the enormous credit of the Gillard and Rudd governments, they have done a huge amount to make these sort of experiences accessible to every Australian kid who can get into university. We've never had anything like this in this country before, and I would go so far as to say there is nothing like this in any other country in the world. In the US you need money to do it. Australia has the best student mobility options in the world. And they're available to your kids in Narromine, your year 12s next year can be at university. They can find out what the university offers if they're good enough to get to university. And I'm sure you've got about a quarter of your kids who are, maybe more. And those kids will go to university. If they're good enough to get to university and they do okay, they'll be able to participate in this. I think it is political blah blah. I don't think we're going to get history wars like we did under John Howard. One of the reasons for that is that Tony Abbott, whatever else you can say about him, is very good on Indigenous policy. So we're not going to get black bashing, which we did get, I'm afraid, under John Howard. So I don't think there'll be any of that sort of thing. Yes, he will want to see more on the strength of liberal institutions and how capitalism has developed the country. I've got no problem with that. I've got no problem about all those curriculum that talks about all those sorts of things. I don't think he wants to get to write the blue-collar workers out of history, though. Nor would he want to. And I think it was largely politicking. Goodbye, gentlemen, and to those of you looking at this at some other time, goodbye, ladies and gentlemen.